Hello everybody, and welcome to Immaterial Minds, a place to talk about profound ideas and imperfect lives. I'm Chris, the immaterial voice, and this is my companion, Mr. Reaper. Mr. Reaper, what are we going to talk about today? That's right, we're going to talk about this curious paper, The Ontological Disproof of the Devil, by the philosopher C.K. Grant. So, let's get on with it. So this paper was published in 1957 in the philosophy journal Analysis. Now I can't find out much information about the author other than that he worked in the UK and that he seems to have been active primarily in the 1950s and 60s. To be honest, I can't even find a picture of him, so if you do know anything more about C.K. Grant, let me know. Anyway, what Grant wants to show is that if we follow the logic of St. Anselm's ontological proof for the existence of God, then we can also disprove the existence of the devil. Grant begins the paper as follows. It is remarkable that St. Anselm and other Christians who accept the ontological argument for the existence of God have failed to notice that this proof also demonstrates the non-existence of the devil, understanding by this expression an absolutely imperfect being. So what is the ontological argument for the existence of God? I'm not going to get into the full details here because I've already made a video about the ontological argument, which you can have a look at here. But, in brief, the basic idea depends on two fundamental assumptions. 1. That God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, and 2. To exist is greater than not to exist. Now together, along with some other minor assumptions, these are thought to prove the conclusion that C, God exists. Of course, you might take one quick look at this argument and think, I'm not very impressed. That's entirely up to you. But many historical figures have been impressed, including great philosophical thinkers such as Descartes and Leibniz, and even people who have rejected the ontological argument have taken it seriously. As Bertrand Russell once said, it is easier to feel convinced that the ontological argument must be fallacious than it is to find out precisely where the fallacy lies. So much for Anselm's ontological argument. Now, what Grant wants to show is that if we accept the premises of the ontological argument, then we must also accept that the devil does not exist. That is, if we take the devil to be an absolutely imperfect being. Let's draw a comparison. Grant's premises can be outlined as follows. If we assume that 1. The devil is that which nothing less great can be conceived, that's to say, the devil is total imperfection, and that 2. To not exist is less great than to exist, which seems to follow from Anselm's own second assumption, then we can also get the conclusion that C, the devil does not exist. In Grant's own words, from the idea of absolute imperfection, it follows that any being answering to this description must necessarily be non-existent, for a completely imperfect being which exists is a contradiction in terms. In other words, if we suppose that existence is one of the properties comprised in the concept of perfection, then non-existence must also be a property of a completely imperfect being. On this view, we might say that the devil is the embodiment, or rather more accurately, the lack of embodiment, of non-existence. Right then, Reaper, what do you think about Grant's argument? What do you mean it's wrong? What is? Well, you might be right about that, Mr. Reaper, and I'll tell you, there are definitely some issues with the argument that we can talk about now. For one thing, and as Grant himself points out, we might not want to define the devil as an absolutely imperfect being. The traditional view of the devil might have him as an absolutely immoral being, but that doesn't mean he's imperfect in every respect, especially in terms of things like his knowledge and his power. It's generally thought that the devil, if he does exist, can at least do some things and he does know some things. That would seem to imply that the devil's attributes don't point to complete imperfection, and for that reason it might not follow from Anselm's logic that he doesn't exist. Nevertheless, there's still an interesting point to be made here. Even if we don't want to think of the devil as complete imperfection, it still seems to follow from Anselm's logic that whatever complete imperfection is, whether that's the devil or not, it really doesn't exist. That's to say, nothing is completely imperfect. But that brings us to the second issue we might want to raise with this argument. Is non-existence really worse than existence, especially in the case of the devil? As the philosopher Albert A. Koch wrote in a much earlier 1918 paper, a twist on the ontological argument might actually be used to prove the very existence of the devil. As Koch explains, if we think of the devil as that than which a worse is inconceivable, i.e. as the most terrible possible thing ever, then surely it would be worse for this thing to actually exist than not to exist. Of course, this assumption completely flips Anselm's second assumption on its head, because we would have to say that in some cases of very terrible things, it's actually worse for them to exist than not to exist. In conclusion, in Koch's view, in contrast to Grant's view, we would have to say that the devil does indeed exist. Alright Reaper, just pull up what Koch said on the screen. Yes, he's called Koch. Now just pull it up. Okay, good. This is how Koch summarises his position. If then that than which a worse is inconceivable exists in intellectu only, i.e. in the mind or understanding only, then it is that than which a worse can be conceived, viz. A worse in re, i.e. in reality. But this is impossible. Therefore, it is certain that something that which a less or worse is inconceivable exists both in the understanding and in reality. Right then, Reaper, that seems to bring us full circle back to the start. We might ask, does being the most imperfect or worst conceivable thing mean that you exist or that you don't exist? What do you think, Reaper? Well, maybe that's the case, but one thing's for sure. Me and a lot of other people enjoy thinking about these kinds of ideas. Now in the end, much like Anselm's ontological argument, I think it all comes down to the powers of reason. Can we find out whether the devil exists using reason alone, or are we doomed to continue playing endless word games until this miserable existence comes to an end and we find out for ourselves? Thanks for watching this video by Immaterial Minds, and let us know what you think in the comments. Do you think we can disprove the existence of the devil, or perhaps prove the existence of the devil, using reason alone? Oh, and if you haven't already, please remember to subscribe, and remember, it's all immaterial.